Hello, class. So, welcome to the last week of content for this class. This is the last chapter we were going over. Next week will be our last week, and we will have our Unit 4 exam then. After that, we are done with the semester. So, one more chapter to go. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to talk about evolution, what it is, and we're going to talk about natural selection. So, what is evolution? Evolution, and I'm going to skip this slide. I want to go into what it is. The big thing I want you to know is evolution is a change in genetic change over time. And that's the key thing. It's genetic change over time. We've talked about Punnett squares like 2 weeks ago, where we talked about looking at different alleles, looking at the alleles that parents have, and seeing what are the changes they're going to pass on those alleles and ultimately the traits that they hold, their phenotypes. Evolution takes that, but looks at it over multiple generations. It looks at genetic change over time. Evolution occurs when there are changes in the heritable traits from generation to generation. Some changes lead to the development of new species. So over time, with the genetics of a group changing, you can get a whole new species. So evolution occurs in populations. I do want you to make sure you know that. Evolution, and we'll start this too, does not occur in individuals, since an individual's alleles do not change. So us, we have our genes, we have our alleles. Those alleles will not change throughout our life. Unless there is a mutation, they will not change. So when we talk about evolution, which is genetic change over time, we are talking about populations. And before we even get further, let's define what the population is. I'm gonna put it up here. Population is a group of the same species in an area. So in this image right here, we have foxes. So that is a population. And when we look at this, we want to look at what's called the allele frequency. The allele frequency is the amount an allele is present within a population. And to do that, you're going to take all the alleles in that population and count one, how many they are, and two, how many of this specifically you want is present. So in a population, allele frequency can change from one generation to the next over time. Some alleles become more common in a population, others do not. So in this case, we have some white foxes that are produced with the little m, and we have black foxes that are produced with at least one big M, because one black fox has two. When we look at gene frequency, what I want you to notice, I want to choose my eraser real quick, is that the number of big M's here. First, we have one big M, two big M's, three big M's, four, five, and six. So we have six big M's, six alleles for black fur here. So if you look at this line here, we have six alleles for black fur, and they already counted the total alleles present. There are 50. That leaves to 0.012. We divide the two, or 12%. So there's only 12% of all the alleles in this population of foxes are the black allele for fur. But with evolution, this allele frequency can change over time. And we'll talk about why or how later on. But allele frequency is the amount the allele is present within a population. So again, allele frequencies vary between populations as well. In the population of Asia, the frequency of alleles that produce black hair is high. I'm going to ignore this. I'm not going to have you calculate it, but think about this example. In Asia, there's more people with black hair, so the allele that produces that black hair is very high. However, in a population in Sweden, the frequency for the allele that produces black hair is very low. If you think of Sweden, a lot of times you may think people with more blonde hair. So in Sweden, the frequency for the black hair allele is low, but in Asia, that frequency for black hair is very high. Those two ideas are make up what's called a gene pool. So a gene pool is the genes present, genes or alleles present in a population. So in Sweden, you don't have as much of the gene for black hair, but in Asia, you'd have a higher frequency for black hair. So the gene pools are very different, but gene pools can change over time. If people from Sweden migrated to Asia and produced offspring with the locals, the allele frequencies in the gene pool of Asia will change over time because that those genes for blonde hair are introduced into the population in Asia, changing that gene pool over time. This is when evolution occurs. Evolution occurs when that gene frequency or gene pool is changing over time. Remember, evolution is just genetic change over time within a population. So now, with that definition, I want you to answer this. Which of the following can evolve according to a biological definition of evolution? Pause, think about it. We'll come back to it. So remember, evolution is a change in genetic change over time in a population. So we look here, we want to see, are we having a change? And is it in a population? And specifically, we're actually looking for a population. So which of the following can evolve? We have a group of fir trees in Oregon. So a group is a population. So that checks out. Earth's climate is not an organism. So we can scratch that out. A single fly as it develops from larva to adult. It's a single fly, not a population. So that's out. A fossilized turtle. Remember, a turtle, not a population. A cell in your body, whose DNA develops mutations as a result of exposure to X-rays. We do have genetic change, but it's a cell in our body, not a population. So the correct answer is A. So explain how the allele frequency of each gene determines the characteristics of a population. So pause, think about this. So what I like to think about is the fox example. We had a low frequency of black fur and a high frequency of white fur. Because of those frequency, we see a lot more foxes with white fur than black fur, because that black fur is uncommon. So the frequency dictated the color of the fox because we simply don't have a lot of genes for black in that whole population. Now, we're going to switch over and talk about how the theory of evolution was developed. At first, we're going to look at um, Culver's principle of superposition. For these, I do want you to know kind of each person's contribution to evolution. So, studying geology demonstrates Culver's principle of superposition. All that is saying that if rock is undisturbed, the oldest layers are on the bottom and the youngest layers on top. So we look here, we have the oldest layers on the bottom. So all these layers down here are old and newer layers on top. So all these layers up here are new. So as you go up, you have newer and newer rocks. So with that, we can start thinking about fossils. So fossils are the remains or impressions of prehistoric organisms preserved um, in rock. And at the fossils at the bottom layers are older than the ones at the top layer that are newer. And fossils of extinct species and older layers of rock suggest living organisms evolved from common ancestors. So as you look at fossils, older ones have characteristics, certain characteristics that you can see are passed on through the different layers of rock, through different generations, different species. But we can see as you go further up, you may have a split in the characteristics. We have more variety. And that kind of gives you a hint that, hey, something's going on where these characteristics from organisms that are the lower layer of the rocks, the older rocks, that characteristic is one still present, but also may change over time. So this suggests that living organisms evolved from common ancestors. Darwin's, and now we're going to talk about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a big, big person in evolution. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species. And he went on a journey that provided evidence for evolution. It started off in Europe in 1831. He went all the way around South America to what's called the Galapagos Islands, which we'll get to in a second, through the Pacific, and all the way back to Europe. And during this time, he documented a great variety of organisms in South America and their relationships to fossils. And he began to think that there were clues to how new species originated. So he started connecting the fossils he saw. Remember, fossils are remains or impressions of prehistoric organisms and living organisms. He started seeing connections between them in terms of their characteristics. Darwin proposed the idea of descent with modification. Descent with modification. So he looked at finches, just small birds, in the Galapagos Islands, which are these small islands off the northwest coast of South America. He saw that their types matched up with the foods they ate. Some had very long and thin beaks to eat insects, and some had very short but thick beaks to eat seeds. And Darwin thought that different finches species all descended from the same ancestor. So he thought, yes, there are different types of finches on these islands, but they all came from a common ancestor. He also saw that the environment of each island influences survival and reproduction of finches living there. Finches with features best suited for the environment were able to survive and reproduce better than others. So there are some islands in the Galapagos that have more seeds. Those that have more seeds, the finches started with the shorter but thicker beaks, were able to survive more because they were able to break open those seeds. On other islands, though, where they have more insects than seeds, finches with the long, narrow beaks made to catch insects were able to survive more. So, depending on the island or the environment, affected the survival and reproduction of the finches there. Did they have the longest slender beaks to catch insects? Or did they have the short but thick beaks to break open seeds? And that's something that Charles Darwin observed on these islands. Yes, there are finches on each island, but they're slightly different based off the environment. Now, we're going to look at logic of what's called natural selection. And with this, I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit and introduce natural selection. So, actually, this doesn't go over. Let's go back real quick. All right, let's talk about natural selection and what it is. So, natural selection is the process where organisms with traits better suited to their environment survive and reproduce um, and lead to more offspring. So, again, natural selection, and it kind of goes it right here, is the inherited characteristics of some individuals make them more likely to obtain resources, survive, and reproduce. And then they're able to pass down those traits. Before we get to that, let's look at these observations in nature. So there's three key observations in nature that led to natural selection. One is genetic variation. Within a species, no two individuals except for identical twins, are exactly alike. Some of this variation is heritable. So it's just like in humans, no two people are exactly alike unless they are identical twins. In addition to that, there is observation that there is limited resources. Every habitat contains a limited supply of resources required for survival. There is no habitat that has an infinite amount of resources. There's always a limited amount. And the next thing is overproduction of offspring. More individuals are born than survive to reproduce. So within populations, more individuals are born than the number that actually survive to be able to reproduce or to reproduce. Not all individuals in the population will be able to reproduce. So there's overproduction of offspring. With these three observations, we have a couple inferences. We can make assumptions we can make. First one is the struggle for existence. Individuals compete for limited resources that enable them to survive. Because we have limited resources and because we have overproduction of offspring, we have a struggle for existence. Individuals have to compete for those limited resources in order to survive. Next, we have the unequal reproductive success. Natural selection. This is one of our key things here. The inherited characteristics of some individuals make them more likely to obtain resources, survive, and reproduce. So some of the characteristics an individual give allow them to be better able to get resources to survive and reproduce. And with that in mind, we are the last inference, descent with modification. Over many generations, a population's characteristics can change by natural selection, even giving rise to new species. So, with the unequal reproductive success or natural selection, those individuals that have a better chance to get resources to survive and reproduce, their characteristics can be selected for. That's called natural selection. And by selected for, they're able to pass them down to the next generation, and so forth and so forth. And this can give rise to a new species, because a new species has those very selective traits that are made for survival. Okay, so natural selection, again, overall, it's a process where organisms with traits better suited to survive and reproduce are passed down to the next generation. And evolution theory is supported by data. Over the years, a large body of careful resources has corroborated and explained the Darwin's findings. So these are a lot of different things, and we're not going to go over them super in depth. But there's been a lot of um, evidence for evolution. So we have fossils where we can see the physical traits of an organism, how it changes over time, over long periods of time, to produce different species. The lab this week will kind of show a little bit of that. We also can look at DNA and even proteins, how the DNA and proteins of different organisms, different species, can be very similar if they're closely related and distant when they're not. But with that, we can start building these evolutionary trees to show that some organisms came from a common ancestor. So we have a lot of different lines of evidence for evolution. And keep in mind, evolution, to put it very simple for biology, is just a genetic change over time, over a long period of time, and it happens in a population. So again, going back to the example with the foxes, we have a lot of white foxes and few black foxes. Evolution can start pushing more foxes to be able to reproduce and survive, thus changing the genetics of the population, leading to evolution. Which of the following statements best supports, which of the following statements supports the concept of natural selection? Pause, think about this, and we'll go over it. So we're looking at natural selection. Individuals with traits best suited to prevail conditions tend to leave more surviving fertile offspring. So, with natural selection, again, it's organisms that are best suited for the environment survive and reproduce. So, and pass down their genes. So, the individuals with traits best suited to the prevailing conditions, leaving more survival and fertile offspring, that is directly natural selection. Oh, wrong color. That is natural selection. We're going to keep that. Traits that increase survival and reproduction in the current generation will be more common in the next generation. Again, natural selection. We want to keep those traits that are going to help individuals survive and reproduce. So this is A and B. So C is correct. And we're going to skip this because we didn't go over artificial selection just yet. So natural selection molds evolution. Natural selection does not create alleles. Instead, it strongly selects alleles that arise by chance. Remember, alleles are different versions of the same gene. Each generation, the best camouflage seahorse survives to reproduce. So we're looking at this example here. We're looking at seahorse. So seahorses, a lot of them are very small. They're very fragile. They are not the predators. They, a lot of times they're prey. So seahorses want to be able to camouflage, want to be able to hide. So when we talk about camouflage, seahorses that can better camouflage are better able to survive and then reproduce, leading to its traits being able to pass on, the traits that led it to be more camouflage being passed on to the next generation. So the alleles conferring camouflage become more frequent each generation because the better the camouflage the seahorse has, the better it's able to survive and then reproduce to pass on its genes. I keep talking about natural selection, but I'm going to write it down here real quick. So natural selection, the definition I want to give you, it's the process where organisms with traits better suited for their environment survive and reproduce, leading to an increase of the and sorry, the environment survive and reproduce, passing on their traits. So again, natural selection is just the process of an organism with traits better suited to their environment survive and reproduce, passing on their traits. Thus, so again, with this seahorse example, the seahorses that are better able to camouflage are better able to reproduce, are better able to survive, better able to get to the age to reproduce, and then are able to pass on their genes. And that's due to the environment they are in. So natural selection, though, does require genetic variation. Since more individuals are born than resources can support, the struggle for survival is inevitable. Some individuals in a population are better than others at surviving and reproducing. So again, since there's a struggle for resources, natural selection requires genetic variation. It requires the individuals within that population to have some differences. And that's because some the individuals with the better traits that survive can better compete, better get those resources, and then better pass down their relationships. Sorry, their traits. So, and with that, we get what's called adaptations. Adaptations enhance sexual or reproductive success. Adaptations are heritable features that provide a selective advantage because they improve the organism's ability to survive and reproduce. So, an adaptation is just a selective advantage that helps the individual survive and reproduce. And the example here is a dandelion. So, the seeds of this flower taste bad. So, plants are not eaten by predators. If the seeds of the flower tasted good, the seeds would be eaten, they'd be broken down, and the plant wouldn't not be able to actually reproduce and pass on its trait. So, an adaptation these plants had is by making their seeds taste bad so animals wouldn't want to eat them. Another example of adaptation is if we go back to the seahorse example. The seahorses adapted to have camouflage. The camouflage was a trait that helped them survive and thus able to reproduce more. So both of those are adaptations. They're heritable features that provide a selective advantage because they improve the organism's ability to survive and reproduce. Bacteria undergo natural selection as well. Bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics have an adaptive trait that non-resistant bacteria lack. Um, so bacteria that are have resistance to antibiotics have an adaptive trait. When antibiotics are administered, resistant bacteria survive and reproduce, while non-resistant bacteria do not. So in this example, we see this first generation where there's no bacteria that have that mutation to be resistant to antibiotics. But the second, we have a random mutation occur. A random mutation occur that makes red, um, this red bacteria resistant to antibiotics. And then we have reproduction and selection. So multiple generations later, if we have antibiotics um, present, you can see we get a lot more red bacteria present. The red bacteria have that gene that makes them immune to the antibiotic. So thus, when you when you um, per- s- when that population of bacteria is when there's antibiotics in that population, it kind of selects for this red bacteria that has that trait to be resistant to the antibiotic. Thus, it passes it down and allows it to be a lot more frequent. Versus when it's absent, when antibiotics are absent, there's no need for that mutation. So we don't really get a big change in that gene anymore, the frequency of that gene. So antibiotic bacteria originally is just a bacteria that mutated randomly to be resistant to the antibiotic. But when antibiotics are present, it then selected for that bacteria that is has that antibiotic gene. And thus that bacteria with that resistance was able to survive and reproduce and change the whole frequency, the allele frequency here. Antibiotics cannot create a resistance allele. The variation and the and resistance was already present in the population. So resistant alleles become more frequent in population over time. Just like I talked about, when this one bacteria mutated to become resistant to antibiotics, it was a random thing. The antibiotics did not create it. But then when the antibiotics were produced, it then let that one bacteria survive more readily and reproduce, causing the whole population to have that gene over time. And that's how that frequency for that gene to resist antibiotics became more common. Now, adaptations enhance reproductive success. Um, Here we have a porcupine fish, a puffer fish, that can swim very fast. When threatened, it inflates, and it also has sharp spines. This defense, these defenses are adaptations. Edible traits, it's another example of adaptations. So these fish are able to inflate themselves and have these spikes that deters predators. This is just an adaptation that led them to be able to survive, led them to be able to reach the age to reproduce. So it's same as the bacteria with the gene for it to resist antibiotics. It's same for the seahorses and so forth. The pufferfish have that adaptation to inflate and have the spikes. But keep in mind, evolution never stops. As environmental conditions change, the phenotypes that natural selection favors also change. Adaptations may seem perfect in one environment, but could be completely wrong in another. So as our world is changing, the environmental conditions are changing. As environmental conditions are changing, the adaptations that were once very selected for could no longer be advantageous. They could actually be, they can actually harm the individual. So if we go back to the foxes example, if we have a group of Arctic fox, most of them will be white, some of them will be black. Say something happens, the foxes are moved to an area that instead of having this white snow, that helps select for white foxes so they can blend in. We take that population of fox and put them in an environment that has, like, say, black dirt or black sand. Now, the foxes with the black fur are camouflaged and are able to hide, and then the ones with the white are not anymore. And over time, those white foxes are going to start dying out because predators can see them, but the black foxes are able to survive because they can survive in that new environment. So again, as the environment changes, it can lead to a change in what is an advantageous trait or not. What adaptation is better suited for that new environment. Evolution does not have a goal though. So in this example here, we have an orchid, which is the plant, and a wasp. So the orchid and its wasp pollinator have evolved alongside one another for long enough that no other animal can pollinate the flower. But the orchid does not evolve in order to better pollinate by the wasp. Neither the orchid nor natural selection has foresight. So, natural selection did not evolve to have this flower simply use a wasp to pollinate itself. It was by random chance that it happened. It's same as how we talked about bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. The mutation occurred before antibiotics were present. But as antibiotics were introduced, it kind of led to that change in the gene frequency, leading to more bacteria being immune to the antibiotics. Same goes here. The orchid did not evolve to be pollinated by a wasp. It did not have that goal. It just so happened that that was its adaptation. It led to it survive more. It led to it being able to reproduce more. So evolution does not have a goal. It does not have a goal. Evolution keeps the best alleles in a population. So instead, orchids that are the best suited for to wasp pollination are most likely to reproduce, so their alleles are passed on to the next generation. So again, evolution wants to keep the best alleles and remove the worst through natural selection. So far, I'm gonna go back real quick. So we know a couple things. Evolution never stops. Evolution is constantly going as the environment changes. Evolution does not have a goal. It does not aim for a certain adaptation, aim for a certain thing. It happens by random, based off the environment. And adaptation keeps the best alleles in the population. The alleles that lead to better survival and better reproduction are selected for via natural selection. Now, we have the term what's called survival of the fittest, but I wanted to define what the fitness is. Fitness describes the organism's genetic contributions to the next generation. in essence, this is the ability for an organism to produce offspring. That's passing on genes. So when we talk about fitness, we're talking about the individual's ability or organism's ability to make offspring successfully and pass on the genes. So in this orchid example, orchids that are best suited to wasp pollination are the most fit because they are most likely to reproduce, so the alleles get passed on to the next generation. Again, the ones that are most fit, meaning the ones that are better able to produce offspring and pass on their genes. So fitness is the ability for an organism to pass on their genes or to produce offspring successfully. Fitness is reproductive success. Fitness involves survival, reproduction, and having their offspring survive to reproduce as well. Even if an organism does not survive, fitness means that its alleles will. So fitness is just the ability of passing on the genes through the offspring, and then those offspring also surviving as well. So fitness is reproductive success because that's the individual, the organism being able to pass on their genes, their alleles. Let's answer this question now. Many plants require moisture to reproduce. What will happen to a plant population during a prolonged drought? Pause, think about this, and we'll continue. Okay, let's continue. So with this, we have plants that require moisture to reproduce, but what happens if they're in a prolonged drought? A, to save the species, some plants have acquired the ability to reproduce without water. Keep in mind evolution. It's genetic change over time in a population. So some plants acquiring the ability that will not happen. Over the individual plants do not change. If none of the plants already have the ability to reproduce without water, the population will go extinct. So if you don't have the genetic diversity, genetic variation to reproduce without water, then yes, the population will go extinct in a drought because you don't have the water anymore. So far, that is correct. Plants can already reproduce. Plants that can already reproduce without water will pass on their alleles to the next generation, while plants that can't won't. So again, plants that can produce without water will pass on their genes because they are fit, because they have the adaptation to survive in a drought. And the ones that don't have that adaptation will not survive. That is correct. That can't happen. So we have B and C as the correct answers. So how can natural selection favor different phenotypes at different times? Pause, think about this. So just like in the last example, if population of plants needs water to reproduce, it's going to select for plants that can use that water successfully to reproduce. But, so that's the phenotype. The phenotype is reproducing using water. But if there's a drought, it changes what the adaptation, what it's successful or not. So then instead of needing water, the correct phenotype or the most advantageous phenotype, it would be to reproduce without water. So natural selection then favors individuals, the plants that can produce without water. That's how natural selection can favor different phenotypes at different times. If it's a change in environment, it's going to favor a different phenotype at that time to better help um, the species survive. So scientists can test for evolution. Scientists can test evolution against a null hypothesis. Null hypothesis, which states that allele frequency does not change from one generation to the next. So remember, a change in gene frequency, evolution is a change in gene frequency over time. So the null hypothesis, which is the opposite of the case, says that allele frequency does not change from one generation to the next. Evolution is not only possible, it's unavoidable. In this fairy population, the alleles big D and little d confer phenotypes for fur color. Big D is dark fur, which is dominant over little d, which is light fur. 64 out of 100 ferrets have dark fur, 36 have light fur. Right now, we're going to talk about what's called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Um, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is unlikely situation in which the allele frequencies do not change between generations. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is this part. Allele frequencies do not change between generations. So these two scientists, Hardy and Weinberg, had this hypothesis that gene frequencies do not change between generations. Um, and it occurs in very specific situations. At this equilibrium, allele frequencies do not change. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium occurs only if a population meets all the following assumptions. Natural selection does not occur, so there's no natural selection. There's no mutation. There's no change in the alleles. The population is large enough to eliminate random changes in the allele frequency. So you need a big population. Individuals mate at random, and there's no migration. There's no population coming in, no population leaving. So with all of this, you would not get a change in the allele frequency over time because natural selection isn't selecting for anything. There's no mutation. There's no change in the allele. There's a big population, which means there's no random chance of change. Individuals mate randomly, and there's no migration, no incoming or exiting um, from the population. And now I realize this PowerPoint did not give out the equation. So two equations allow us to calculate allele frequency, assuming the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium are met. Two equations represent the relationship between the allele frequencies and genotype. So the first one, and I will fix this for you, is P plus Q equals 1. P is the frequency of the dominant allele, and Q is the frequency of the recessive allele. So this is the dominant, this is the recessive. So with their frequencies, they should up to 100%. But we also get P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. This is the genotypes. So if we use the D's, for example, like in this picture, P squared is big D, Q squared is little d, so PQ is the heterozygotes. So this top equation, excuse me, is used to determine just the frequency of the individual allele. But the bottom one is used to determine the frequency of each type of genotype, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. For this class, I'm not going to have you use this formula. We're not going to do the calculations, but I do want you to know the formulas and what they mean. Allele frequencies change, always change. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is used for model, but in real populations, the assumption of Hardy-Weinberg are always violated. And that's because natural selection and mutations do occur. Random changes in allele frequencies are common. Individuals rarely mate randomly. There's always some level of migration between populations. So with all the assumptions for the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, it is very rarely met. Very rarely met. So normally we do not have equilibrium. We do not have this Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It is a nice concept. It helps us explain gene allele frequencies, but in practice, it's very unlikely. So, moving forward, though, let's talk about how natural selection can shape populations. And there's three modes for this. So, natural selection can change populations in three ways: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. These are distinguished by their effects on the phenotype of the population. And we're going to go over each one. So, directional. Directional, let's look at this example. So, black moths survive and reproduce more. So, if we look here, we have these light color moths, dark moths, and medium moths. And in the beginning, we have this nice, what's called a bell-shaped curve, which is a lot of medium moths survive, with some dark and light also surviving. And directional selection, you can see that due to some selective force, say in this case, trees becoming darker, we're getting a shift in that population. So now instead of more medium color, we get more darker color. So in directional selection, we're getting a complete shift in this curve, leading to a different phenotype, a full shift in one different phenotype. And I'll write that down too. Favors one phenotype. Then we have disruptive selection, favors extreme phenotypes. Very light and dark snails both survive to reproduce more than intermediate snails. So here we see, again, light, medium, and dark color snails, nice bell-shaped curve, but then we have some type of selection, where in this case, it's a mix of light and dark color rocks. So with this, we see that the light color snails survive and the dark survive. So those populations both go up, but the bottom does not. So in disruptive selection, the extreme phenotypes are selected for. So, and then the last example is stabilizing. So I want to skip to this bottom one. So again, in the very beginning, we have for babies a small, medium, and large babies that are born. Very nice bell-shaped curve. And then for the selective force, you have health problems for the extremes. So small babies may not be able to survive, and large babies may not be able to survive. So we see both their populations going down, but then we lead to a bigger increase in the medium population. So stabilizing selection leads to the intermediate phenotype being selected for. Intermediate selected for. So disruptive leads to a push to one extreme. This disruptive leads to a push to both extremes. And stabilizing leads to selective for the intermediate phenotype. Now, I think we're going to go over a couple more things and then we'll be done. So why are harmful alleles sometimes maintained in a population? So one example for why harmful alleles are present in a population is heterozygous advantage, in which heterozygous is favored over homozygous. Sickle cell anemia, excuse me, is harmful and it causes what's called sickle cell disease. So this is a disease where your red blood cells are misshaped and they may not be able to function properly, leading to a lot of different things that can happen. But sickle cell alleles confer heterozygous advantage. For example, homozygous people who are homozygous for the allele for sickle cell do not have sickle cell disease and are protected from malaria. But the two heterozygous mates, their child might have sickle cell. So with heterozygous advantage, the heterozygous people who are carriers or heterozygous for sickle cell anemia are protected against malaria, which is a very rough disease, a disease that can kill. So that is why heterozygotes for sickle cell are still present in a population because they have that advantage still. They're immune to malaria versus people without any allele for sickle cell anemia can still get malaria and die from it. But people who have sickle cell anemia who are homozygous recessive for sickle cell disease can die from the actual disease. So the heterozygotes for sickle cell, the carriers for sickle cell disease, have an advantage because they can survive malaria. So, as humans, let's answer this question. As humans migrate out of Africa and towards Northern Europe, reduce exposure to ultraviolet light, ultraviolet radiation selected for lighter skin color. What type of selection does this illustrate? Let's pause, think about this, and continue. So, with this, people are migrating out of Africa. We have the selection for lighter skin color. Since we're selecting for one different phenotype, which is a change in the normal phenotype, we are having a directional selection. If we're stabilizing, when we keep the normal, we keep the intermediate. Disruptive means we selected both extremes, but directional, we go towards one extreme. In this case, we're going towards the lighter skin color. I think the last thing, and I'm going to skip this for now, we're going to go over artificial selection. So artificial selection, I'm going to write it down here. Let me get my different color. Artificial. Oh, selection is the process where humans intentionally breed organisms with desirable traits. So again, artificial selection is the process where humans intentionally breed organisms with desirable traits. So two examples we have here are the wild mustard and dogs and wolves. So with the wild mustard plant, farmers were able to select for different traits to create different crops such as broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, and cabbage, and this other one. So they were all of those different vegetables come from the same plant, the wild mustard plant. But through artificial selection, through selective breeding, we were able to get all these different types of vegetables. A more common example that a lot of people hear about are dogs. So dogs can be selectively bred to produce different breeds, such as the Australian Shepherd, the Bloodhound, Golden Retriever, Doberman, Chihuahuas, Wiener dogs, and so forth. And all those different breeds were developed through artificial selection, through humans choosing which dogs to have reproduce to pass on their traits. And that's why we have such a wide variety of different dog breeds. It's because of artificial selection. Through selectively breeding dogs to produce dogs with specific traits, either bigger dogs um, or small dogs like a Chihuahua. So that's artificial selection. Remember, natural selection is run through the environment and environmental changes. Artificial selection is run by humans, intentionally breeding organisms to get specific traits. So humans artificially alter gene frequency. And this kind of goes over the same thing that I talked about. How we can take a wolf, we can artificially select to make domestic dogs. This increases the frequency of the desired alleles in a population. So, and I think that's where we're gonna end. Actually, we have one more thing, which is selective sexual selection directly influences reproductive sex. Um, so sexual selection is selecting for different traits um, in a specific sex. So a lot of times you think of this as the males in different species. Males in these um, these with the big horns that are able to fight more. We have birds that have these colorful feathers or able to create these nice nests. These are examples of sexual selection. Building complex nest, flashy showing plumage with feathers, and butting heads with rival males all appear to waste energy. So how can natural selection allow for traits that apparently reduce survival? And this is because of sexual selection. So selection results from the variation in the ability to obtain mates. Again, the variation in the ability to attain mates. Selection results from either competition for access to the other sex, i.e., these rams right here, competing for access to the females, or from one sex choosing the attractive mates of the others. So that's common in birds. So the more attractive the male is, the more likely it will get a female. So sexual selection is just the ability to obtain mates either by fighting for them or by showing off. Individuals with the sexually selected trait mate the most and therefore pass along their genes most. Mating is not random, and that's the key thing here. So remember in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we talk about mating being random, but in a lot of species, it's not at all. Mating is not random. We have sexual selection. Females either choose who they want to mate with, such as in birds, or the males have to fight it out, such as in the rams. The mating is not random. So, and keep in mind, if we take a step back, mutations are cause evolution to occur. So mutations, a change in a gene, can lead to different phenotypes, and depending on the phenotype, may be advantageous or not, maybe an adaptation or not. So mutations can create genetic diversity. Mutations are random changes in the sequence of DNA. They can be harmful, but many are harmless and some are beneficial. Beneficial mutations are passed on to the next generation, so their frequency increases over generations. And this is where we're going to pause for now. So, again, with this, know what natural selection is, know the contributions of different sciences. The book will go a little more in depth with this. Um, the lab this week will help you look at evidence of evolution, especially over long periods of time. And like always, if you have any questions at all, reach out to me, let me know, and I can help you out. But that is our last week of content. Next week will be our Unit 4 exam.